The Clear Signal with Steve Visscher.
Well, hi everyone. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you with us as always. Clearsignal.com.au, of course, is the website. You can find out everything you know about me, about the show and what we do, what the ethos is of this show and what we're trying to achieve with it. All there at clearsignal.com.au. And there's some contact details there too if you'd like to ever drop me a line. Always great to hear from people. And of course, we're also on YouTube these days. I'm pretty keen to push that mythical YouTube algorithm. So if you're of a mind to help me out with that, I'd really appreciate it. Clear Signal Media is where you'll find me there, and you'll find all of this content that you've been listening to in the audio format. It's been converted to video, and we're doing full video episodes now as well. And just bear with me as I master my skills at turning. I'm pretty handy at editing audio, but video is a whole new kettle of fish for me. So we're just working on that, and I'd really appreciate your support over there on the YouTube channel. Well, this week we're going to be looking again at defence and defence strategy here in Australia. Sometimes I think we get a little bit apathetic towards where we stand in the world strategically. A lot of people, think we spend a bit too much money on defence, or perhaps they don't really understand why defence is important. And we're living in very, very uncertain times these days as we record this. So it is something that needs to be pushed further into the public consciousness, I believe, and I thought we'd explore that angle today. There's lots to talk about, submarines, AUKUS, what's happening with the US in terms of their policy and the way they're treating their allies these days. Is that a problem? Is it not a problem? There's lots of things that we hear about in the media from day to day that I think really can be fleshed out in much greater detail. And we're going to have a great chat about that today with Dr. Marcus Hellyer. Marcus is a well-respected defence analyst, defence strategist. He's been in the defence industry for a very long time, and his opinion and his analysis is widely sought by people from within government and also externally around the media and other places like that. He joins us on the line now, and we're going to have a great discussion. Marcus Hellyer, welcome to the show. Great to meet you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries. Well, I thought we might talk a bit about strategy today and Australia's strategic place in the world, such as it is, and where we're all at. Because obviously, it's on a lot of people's minds at the moment. Where we've seen, for example, Chinese have been sailing their ships around our nation virtually unopposed. Which, if it's not of concern to people, I believe it should be. But there's a lot of things to consider. We've had changes in the White House, of course, which has got people thinking about, are our alliances still as rock solid as they might once have been? So there's much to consider there. And I just wonder from your point of view, with your experience, where that all sits with you.
Yeah, well, we live in interesting times. There's that old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I don't know if it really is an old Chinese curse, but it has entered our lexicon. And we certainly live in interesting times at the moment. Now, I have friends and colleagues who have been working in the defence and strategic policy sectors for many, many years. So I'm kind of old, but these are people who are even older than me. And the unanimous view is that these truly are the most uncertain strategic times and potentially the most dangerous times that anyone can remember. And even exceeding the Cold War. And there's a number of reasons for that. And probably the most important one is that current day China, under the Chinese Communist Party, is more powerful than the Soviet Union was. And the relativity of power between China and the US is very different from the USSR and the US. And so China is a more powerful potential adversary than the USSR was. And we add to that, China is really in our own region. So for the USSR, Australia truly was a backwater. But for China, Australia has very important strategic location. And we are also important because of our relationship with the United States. So all of that means we're not a backwater now. We are sitting front and center in sort of the most important strategic rivalry since World War II. And, all of us, not just our leaders, but I think everyday Australians need to at least spend a little bit of time thinking about what that means for the country.
Much has been made of the so-called peace dividend, say, post-World War II, where it's long been said people of perhaps my generation, for example, Generation X, have benefited from that in such a way that we haven't had to fight for anything. We haven't had to think about that. But we're sort of coming into an era now where some people will, who think about this a lot, talk about it being shades of 1935 again, that type of era where people are maybe just taking their eyes off the ball a little. I wonder how people in Canberra look at that sort of thing, whether it's still a plaything for them or whether perhaps even some recent events are maybe starting to focus their view just a little bit.
Well, I think it depends a little on who you talk to in Canberra. So, people in the broader strategic policy community, so analysts, commentators, people at think tanks, so sort of people like me, have been saying for a number of years now, the world is very different from the world we grew up in. So that roughly 70 years of, broadly speaking, peace since the end of World War II. Now, it hasn't been universal peace. If you were a person in Vietnam and they just celebrated 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, they've had some very difficult times, including in their dealings with the US, and there have been other countries too. We had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so it hasn't been complete peace. But compared to World War One and World War Two, we have lived in very peaceful times, and that's the world we've grown up in. And we've grown up in a world where we've assumed the US has our back, that whatever the threat is, the US has our back. So all of those things are fundamentally changing. But I don't think our mindset has changed fast enough. And, we see it, and I'm not saying vote, we've got an election in 2 days. I'm not saying vote for Arwell or vote for Dutton. I'm not, I'm apolitical in that regard. But when we look at the things that the government has been saying, they're not sort of, well, they are saying, yes, we're in interesting times, but they're not sort of, in my view, acting fast enough to do anything about it. There's been some increases in defence funding, for example, but not at the scale that would indicate they perceive a level of danger and threat. So, for example, in the Cold War, we generally spent well over 3% of GDP on defence. Well, at the moment, we're at 2%, and the government has no plan to get us to 3%. So they're growing it to about 2.3% over 10 years. Well, that's a very slow growth path to a pretty low level of spending, I think, relative to where the threat level is. So I don't think it is completely sunk in to governments. Interestingly, the coalition under Peter Dutton and Andrew Hastie, who's the Shadow Minister for Defence, they did announce last week that they were going to increase defence spending to 2.5% in the next 5 years and then to 3% in the next 10 years. And we're sort of seeing a bit of daylight between the two major parties in terms of policy positions. But yeah, I would agree that we are not investing in defence to the extent we should be.
Yeah, it's interesting too, isn't it? It's an interesting tightrope to walk because there's two aspects, of course, to defence spending. One of it, of course, is getting enough people and paying and making sure we've got enough personnel to man our defence forces, of course, but also technology being where it is today. It's very, very expensive, and we're going to talk a little bit about AUKUS in this discussion, of course, which is soaking up a lot of defence spending and potentially into the future, huge amounts of defence spending on those submarines. But we also have a recruiting problem. We need to be looking at spending money on getting more people interested in joining our military. So there's many, many ways that the government has to look at spending that money. And maybe, as you say, it's important that we do look at upping that percentage of GDP again.
Yeah, so even if we did increase defence spending to, say, 3%, we have that issue of can you actually spend it? So you need people in your defence force, even though we've now got autonomous systems, so-called killer drones. I will say the Australian Defence Force has been remarkably slow in picking up on those kinds of technologies compared to some other countries. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done in the Australian Defence Force. But even with those systems, you still need people. And a declining percentage of the Australian population is interested in joining the Australian Defence Force. And I think we kind of need a whole-of-nation effort to turn that around because it doesn't matter how much you spend. If you haven't got the people, it's not going to help. So And I'm not simply saying we need to bring back the draft. I mean, that's a very easy thing for old white guys like me to say. Well, we need conscription because young people are slackers and, they're just interested in their smashed avo and they don't want to serve their country. Well, I don't buy that. But I do think we need to kind of change the offering so it appeals to young people more. But my view has always been, well, if we're going to implement a draft of conscription for younger Australians, then I think we should also expect older Australians, people of my generation, to also contribute. Now, that doesn't mean we give 50, 60-year-old people a rifle, but there's lots of other things, lots of community service that older people can be doing. I'm a member of the rural fire service, and I've been doing that for over 20 years. And so, people can, volunteer to help in hospitals. They can volunteer to drive senior citizens to the library. Everybody should be contributing. So,
yep.
But I think we're not at the point yet where we need to move to conscription. Well, I don't think we've tried every sort of solution to turn the recruitment problem around yet. I'm still hopeful there are things we can do to rectify that.
I think a lot of it comes down to communication. I would compliment you for being an RFS member. I'm a former CFA member myself, so I know that the spirit of volunteerism is one way where, I mean, that's an interesting sector, actually. They get out and they talk to people about why it matters that you're a part of this community. I don't often see that coming from defence. They've got interesting ways of, talking to the young folk in their language, which I find a little bit immature, quite honestly. But I often think too, it's something to do with the way defence recruiting operates. I often think that people get into the defence here not because of the recruiting process. They tend to get into it despite the recruiting process. And I think if it's one thing they could possibly do is even look at that way that they approach that. They make it very, very difficult for people to get in, even at lower entry-level jobs, I find.
Yeah, that's right. And there's plenty of horror stories out there of people who applied and were selected, but the whole process took over a year from the initial application to when they sort of march in for their recruit training. And in this day and age, if you're waiting a year, something better has come along, and that young person will have gone off and done something else. So there's certainly things defence can do to improve there. But I do think we need to sort of open the aperture a bit and look at mixed models of where people can serve in ways other than full-time service. And so there are areas where people could be reservists, but not sort of reserve infantrymen, but maybe working in the cyber sector, as reservists, for example, and they can bring their civilian skills into the defence sector by serving as reservists, just as a lot of the medical personnel in defence are reservists who are professional doctors in their day job. So, I think we need a lot more imagination in this space. So we certainly shouldn't give up yet, and I think we can crack this issue. But yeah, I do think there needs to be a broader conversation, national conversation about volunteerism and serving your country and giving back to your country and your community.
Absolutely.
And that's not just in the defence space.
If we turn our eyes to potential regional conflict that may or may not be coming, of course, we think of China, we think of Taiwan, of course. We can't have this discussion without talking about recent changes in US administration with Donald Trump having his different take on the way he's operating now. It has a lot of people wondering whether we can rely on the US still to honour their commitments. I kind of the view that I think we are still strategically important, geographically important, if you like, for the US, and maybe that goes in our favour. If, for example, it came to blows between China and Taiwan and the US got involved in that, does that make Australia a vitally key part of their chain of attack, their plan of attack? They've got to be basing out of here, surely.
The short answer is yes, and it's yes in many different ways. So we in Australia often think we're sort of just hanging down off the bottom of Southeast Asia here, a long way from anywhere. But really, we are kind of the linchpin of the Indo-Pacific. So if you want to move from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, that whichever way you go, it's going to bring you close to northern Australia. So we are in sort of striking range of the Malacca Strait, which is the major shipping lane between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. We are very close to the Sunda Strait, which is an alternate way. Of course, the Arafura Sea, is very close to Northern Australia. So Australia is very strategically important when we're thinking about not just the Pacific Ocean by itself or the Indian Ocean by itself, but as one big kind of complex. So we have very desirable geography in that regard. The other way in which we're very desirable, particularly to the US, is many of the US bases in the Western Pacific, whether we're talking about in Japan, sort of mainland Japan, or the Japanese island of Okinawa, which is very close to Taiwan, or in Guam, which is a US-owned island in the Pacific. All of those key US bases fall within what we call the Chinese missile umbrella. They can be targeted relatively easily by Chinese missiles. And so when you have a small number of bases, that's a small number of targets. And so the Chinese can essentially, hit them with large numbers of missiles, whether they're missiles launched from ground launches in China itself or launched from long-range combat aircraft such as bombers, or launched from submarines or from ships. There's a lot of ways that the Chinese can strike those US bases. And so that if those bases are taken out, it makes it very hard for the US to respond to Chinese aggression, whether it's against Taiwan or US allies such as Japan, because there are contested waters and islands between China and Japan, or in the South China Sea, where China is contesting claims for territory there with virtually all of the maritime Southeast Asian states. So the US is trying to disperse. So not all of its assets is sort of sitting duck targets for China. And one of the areas that they're dispersing to is Northern Australia, in particular Darwin and the Australian Air Force Base south of Darwin at Tyndall. And so the US is building a lot of infrastructure in Northern Australia, so improving airfields, improving fuel supplies. They're rotating Marines through Darwin. And of course, you mentioned AUKUS, and part of AUKUS is not just Australia acquiring submarines, but the United States rotating its nuclear submarines through HMAS Sterling outside of Perth. And so that Australian real estate means that the US are far enough away from China to be survivable, but close enough to be able to respond to Chinese aggression against US allies.
Yeah, we see China, a lot of people, defence planners you talk to around the place, seem to be thinking that China will look at perhaps if they are going to move on Taiwan, they might do that around 2027. Strategically speaking, and particularly now with the tariffs going in and the impact presumably that's having on Chinese industry and perhaps even the Chinese political base, is there a risk now that China may move that timetable forward?
Yes. Well, I think there's a number of reasons why. Well, first of all, we shouldn't sort of adhere to that fixed timetable. So that sort of is the Davidson window. So that was a US admiral who ran the US Indo-Pacific Command. And he sort of postulated that date for a number of reasons. But that's just his view. And obviously Xi Jinping is not operating on Admiral Davidson's timetable.
No.
So it could be sooner, it could be later. Well, what could bring it sooner? Well, the first thing, as you mentioned, is a lot of people, including here in Australia, are getting very concerned about US commitments to its allies under Donald Trump. And it's very hard to know exactly what Donald Trump is thinking about. Is he willing to fight for allies? Is he willing to fight for Taiwan? It's very hard to know that. And I referred earlier to Andrew Hastie, the opposition defence spokesman, who released the opposition's defence policy last week. And in doing so, he said Donald Trump is very unpredictable and we cannot take anything for granted. So we've now got one of the major parties who are sort of saying whatever the rest of us think, but, they're actually coming out and saying it. We can't take anything for granted. So, all of the Indo-Pacific is thinking that. And so Xi Jinping will be looking very closely and going, well, okay, is the US going to support its allies? The US is kind of letting Vladimir Putin get away with its invasion of Ukraine and seems to be blaming it on Zelensky. So Xi Jinping will be looking very carefully at that. So, his calculus is being shaped by Donald Trump's actions or indeed inaction. So that's all part of the uncertainty here. The other thing is when we talk about threats, there's sort of two things we need to take in consideration. One is intent, what is the potential adversary thinking? And the other one is means, or in military terms, capability. I mean, they can think whatever they like, but if they haven't got, the military power to do anything about it, who cares? Well, what we're seeing is that Chinese military power is growing exponentially.
Absolutely.
So at rates far greater than sort of our intelligence analysts were predicting even recently. So, China already has a bigger navy than the United States, for example, and they very kindly sent part of it down here to Australia to show it off to us, to make that point very clearly that we can now reach out and touch you in Australia. So, one of the ships that came down here had 112 missile cells. Well, each one of those missile cells could be carrying, a cruise missile that could strike one of our cities. So, Chinese military power is growing, and there's big question marks about the willingness of the US to maintain its position in the Western Pacific and, fight for its allies. So, there are very big question marks there. And I do have the sense that if Xi Jinping sees an opportune time, he will act. Now, it may not start with an all-out invasion, an all-out bombardment. It could start with coercion, with a blockade, with, deterring other countries from trading with Taiwan to try and force it into surrender through an economic blockade. But it could start with an all-out surprise attack. And so that's, one of those big uncertainties. And, if the US, well, there's two sort of choices the US has. One is to fight, one is not to fight. If it doesn't fight, it's essentially said, okay, China, you are now, the rooster here. You're, the Western Pacific is your backyard. We're not going to challenge you over that. Okay, so the US is gone from the Western Pacific. The other option is they fight. Now, if they do fight, one outcome is that they lose. And if they lose, again, it'll have a similar kind of outcome. So those are bad outcomes. And so the best strategy for the US and its allies to have is to have enough military power and enough intent to deter Xi Jinping from starting a conflict, whether it's over Taiwan, over Japan, over the South China Sea. And so when people say, gosh, we don't, if we start building up our Navy and our Air Force will get into an arms race. No, it is not an arms race. It is having enough effective military power to deter autocrats from solving issues through military force.
I made a comment on a radio interview back when the Land Forces Expo was on last year, and there was a lot of protests around. And the comment that I made then was, everybody would like to live in a perfect world where we didn't need all this stuff. The sad reality is, and as you quite clearly outlined there, we don't live in a perfect world, and we do need to be thinking about upgrading our weapons platforms, embracing new technology, and making sure we have that pipeline of recruitment coming in. All of these things need to be considered. Obviously, they haven't been paying enough attention to this, our defence planners, over arguably the last 20 years, let's say, and maybe even longer. This is something now that we need to be spending money on, whether we like it or not. And the fact that a small flotilla of Chinese ships with huge capacity could appear, some 600 k's off our coast, within striking distance of bases like Garden Island, like our two major RAF bases, the list goes on. This is stuff that really needs to be getting the attention not only of our military and our political leadership, but also of the general public. People need to understand why this expenditure is important.
Yeah, look, I agree. And, as the saying goes, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You Well, you can't simply hide from it. Now, cutting defense spending at the end of the Cold War was probably justified and everybody was reaping a peace dividend, but we are no longer in those post-Cold War days of, unipolar American power. Another thing I would say is that, and it gets back to this issue of, threats come from intent and capability. Once a country has the actual capability, then it can start to think about what it's going to do with it. So people may say, well, yeah, China's building a big navy and a big air force because it just wants to get Taiwan back. Well, once it's got Taiwan back, I wouldn't be confident that that is the final step, particularly if it has driven the US out of the Western Pacific. So, if China has a 400, 500 ship navy, it's not just going to be sitting at home minding its own business. Okay, the Chinese Communist Party will think of things to do with it. And another thing I'd point out is that, so we shouldn't, I think people keep coming back to the Taiwan contingency, but I would say, well, don't just think about the Taiwan contingency.
No.
What we are seeing is a reshaping of the great power order, the balance of power between the US and China. Now, this is not the first time that we have seen the great power order being reshaped. We've seen it throughout history, going all the way back to antiquity. But in the 20th century, we saw that in World War I and World War II. We saw empires, fall. We saw empires start wars in an attempt to hold on to their position to try and defeat an adversary before it got too powerful. So we have seen great powers rise and fall just in the last century or so. And that is what is going on at the moment. We're seeing the rise of a great power in China, and the US is trying to work out what to do about it. And I think the challenge for all of us at the moment is the Trump administration is not doing that in a very considered way in concert with its allies. I mean, if you were trying to build up a coalition to deter China, you wouldn't be declaring a trade war on your closest allies in Japan, South Korea, and in Australia and in Europe. So there's sort of messages are out of sync here coming from the US.
Yeah, we certainly need clarity from them. There's no doubt about that.
One of the things when we do see a reshaping of the global order and major power conflict is you can have second and third order effects that you just wouldn't have predicted. So we keep coming back to US versus China, but in that sort of, reshaping of the global order, all kinds of other conflicts can break out. And one historical example I like to give is that in World War II, the first land campaign that Australia fought was in the Middle East, but we're all aware of El Alamein and North Africa. But actually, before that, we were fighting the French in Lebanon and Syria because the French had essentially reached an armistice with Nazi Germany, and most of the French Empire was Vichy French, so the French faction that was aligned with Nazi Germany. And so Australia's first land campaign was fighting the French. Now, France have been our ally in World War I. We've been fighting to defend them, and the British Empire and the French were very close allies. And there we were in 1941 fighting the French. Now, nobody, I don't think, would have predicted 2 or 3 years before that Australia would be fighting France in a land war in the Middle East. So these strange, contingencies can arise when big wars start, and it's incredibly hard to predict. So again, I would caution people going, well, we're never going to fight a war with China, so what do we need to prepare our defence force for? Well, it's very hard to predict what our defence force could be doing in a few months' time, let alone in 3, 5, or 10 years' time.
Let's move on to AUKUS, Marcus, and have a bit of a talk about that. Can you explain to our audience who may not be so engaged with defence issues? It's a trilateral agreement, try saying that 3 times fast, between Australia, the UK and the US. What does that actually mean in practical terms beyond submarines? Because it is much more than submarines.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. What actually is AUKUS? And as far as I'm aware, I've never actually seen an AUKUS charter or, a single document signed by the three leaders of the country saying what AUKUS actually is. So you sort of have to reverse engineer it. So there's a number of components, but ultimately it is a technological partnership. So it is not a military alliance. We already have a military alliance with the United States. We don't actually have any formal alliance with the UK. People keep saying the UK is our ally, but we don't actually have a formal alliance with the UK. So AUKUS is a technological partnership. And there's a number of components to that. The one that most people are familiar with is the plan for Australia to acquire nuclear powered but not nuclear armed submarines. And the way that plan has been developed is that the first submarines we are to get will be in the 2030s, and they will be secondhand US Navy submarines that will be transferred to the Royal Australian Navy. And then in the 2040s, we will start to receive British submarines, but designed by Britain for the Royal Navy, the British Navy, but built in Australia. And they are meant to start coming in the 2040s. And then maybe sometime in the 2050s, we will have a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines. So it is a very long kind of pathway
project
here that will take a long time to deliver. The government, when it announced this pathway, estimated the cost at between $268 and $368 billion. So a lot of money involved there. And a number of commentators, including myself, have sort of pointed out all the risks involved in that. I call myself an AUKUS agnostic. So I'm not saying don't do it, or I'm not saying do it. You have to accept the fact that both major parties, Liberal and Labor, support AUKUS. So, it's kind of irrelevant what I think. But there are a number of risks around that, which we can talk about later. But so moving on from the submarines, that's the so-called Pillar 1 of AUKUS. There's also Pillar 2, which is a range of advanced areas of technology with military applications, including quantum physics, undersea warfare, space, a whole range of advanced areas where the three countries have agreed to work together to share technologies, so we can sort of get the benefit of all working together. So that's Pillar 2. And then some people sort of call it Pillar 3. It's not officially called that, but that is an effort by the three countries to kind of unify their trade controls, their defense export controls, to make it easier to trade between the three countries with defense technologies, and to sort of bring our industrial bases closer together so that companies in one country can more easily supply components or systems into the other countries. So those are the three big parts of AUKUS. So it is the submarines that sort of grab the headlines just because of was involved.
Well, let's look at those submarines because everybody wants to talk about it. Australia's fleet of Collins-class submarines, they're aging. They are old platforms now. People I talk to in the submarine community tell me that these days they are very capable platforms, but of course they are limited. They are diesel-electric boats, so they don't have the endurance, they don't have the range that is offered to a country like Australia with such a huge coastline. In terms of endurance, obviously, a nuclear boat is only restricted really by how much food it can carry. So that's an advantage to us. I suppose that also comes with it once these mythical boats do arrive. It allows us to change our posture a little bit rather than being a defence force. If we wanted to project a little bit of power, I guess that allows us to do that as well and to get up into areas that perhaps previously we couldn't get. Now, we talk about China and we talk about potential adversaries. Is that really an important consideration, or could we have done that perhaps with the attack class, which is what would have otherwise been built?
Right. So the attack class was a French submarine that Australia had selected, and we had started a program with the French to build the attack class submarine, which sort of weirdly was a conventionally powered submarine, so one using diesel generators and electric batteries, that had been reverse engineered from their own submarine, which was a nuclear submarine. So it was kind of weirdly, we started by picking a conventional boat derived from a nuclear boat, and then we chucked that all out the window because we decided under Prime Minister Morrison what we really wanted was nuclear submarines. And we went to the US and the UK, and a lot of people have said, well, why didn't we just go back to the French and say, can we just get the nuclear version of your submarine? And, there's a big story there that we can talk about. But
I would love to flesh that out, actually.
that's another conversation. But look, yes, everybody agrees that, broadly speaking, nuclear submarines are more capable than conventionally powered submarines. They have greater range, they're faster, they don't need to surface to recharge their batteries. They're bigger, so they can carry, and they have more power, so they can carry bigger sensors, so more powerful sonars. They can generally carry more weapons, so more missiles that they can launch, for example. So generally, they are more capable. There's a few things they may not do as well that require being stealthy in shallow waters, but broadly speaking, they're regarded as more capable. And there's a lot of countries that would like to have nuclear-powered submarines. And I suspect that if the US continues to be unreliable, we'll see countries like Japan and South Korea building their own nuclear submarines because they actually have the technology. So the problem is Australia doesn't have the ability to design and build them by itself. So it needs help from its AUKUS partners. But our AUKUS partners are absolutely flat out meeting their own demands. So one of the big questions around AUKUS is, will the US actually have spare submarines to transfer to us because they're not meeting their own requirements already? So that's one of the questions. Another question is, if they do give us submarines, will it be on a timeline that allows us to transition from our current Collins-class submarines, which, as you quite rightly said, are aging? So yes, they're capable, large conventional submarines, but they are getting a bit long in the tooth. And to keep them going, they're going to need to go through very deep maintenance cycles and serious upgrades, which come with a lot of technical risk. If you take any old machine and try and upgrade it and turn it into, the latest and greatest machine, there's a lot of technical risk around that. Another risk is that a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines is going to take a lot more crew than our current fleet of 6 Collins-class submarines. So potentially, 3 to 4 times as many submariners. And we started our conversation today by talking about recruitment and retention challenges. And so, good luck trying to find 3 to 4 times as many submariners. So there are a lot of risks around the AUKUS program, even if you think, spending all of that money on nuclear-powered submarines is a good idea. So there's a long way to go here, and we are not out of the woods yet on this at all.
Let's look at the world of the theoretical, and it's all said and done now, and it's not going to change. But of course, the attack class, had it been built, was based on the French Barracuda class, as you mentioned, perhaps an older generation nuclear boat, but obviously still in service and highly capable. Would we have been better served to have gone back to the French if it had been decided that we wanted a nuclear boat? Rather than re-engineering that design to make it a diesel-electric boat, could we have gone back to the French and said, hey, about that diesel-electric thing, no, we don't want that now. We want an off-the-shelf option. Had they done that, we might have well been a lot closer now to at least getting the first of those boats in the water for trials.
Yeah, look, my own view is we didn't really do a good analysis of alternatives back when that decision was made. And ultimately, Scott Morrison was Prime Minister and he was the one driving this. So you need to talk to him to see what, he was really trying to do. And there are still people out there who are saying, look, it's not too late. It's not too late. We can go back to the French and we can go to Mr. Macron and say, we want your nuclear submarines, pretty please. I do think it's a bit late for that. We've often changed many times in the last sort of 15 years around submarines. So originally we were thinking of doing a son of Collins, a kind of evolved Collins. And then we were thinking we would get the Japanese submarines off the shelf. That was under Prime Minister Abbott. Then he got knifed, and so then we conducted a competition, which the French won. Then we junked that and went with the AUKUS approach. Well, so all of that has been happening, and we still don't have any submarines, and the columns have continued to age. And, as that philosopher Scher said, you can't turn back time, and so time has been ticking and the submarines have been aging. So I would not necessarily advocate, changing course at this point in time. But what we need to be doing is we need to be hedging the risk. And, so all smart businesses, if they want to remain in business, hedge their risks. And so at this point in time, we need to be hedging the risk around the alliance in general. So I'm not saying abandon the alliance, but we need to be thinking, where can we be more self-reliant? What are the things we absolutely need to be able to do ourselves? And where can we, accept a bit of risk and rely on the US to do things for us? So that's the first area. And then the second area of hedging is around AUKUS submarines. And, I'm not saying that won't be delivered, because no one actually can really say for sure. And because of that, we need to be doing other things. So if AUKUS submarines don't happen, or they're delayed, or we don't get as many as we like, or by the time we get them, somebody's invented some cool technology that can detect submarines underwater and blow them up. If any of those things happen, we need fallbacks. And so to me, what that says is we need to be acquiring other systems that will give us the sorts of effects, that's a defensy term for, they can do the sorts of things that we would like submarines to do. So if it's sinking ships, we need other ways to sink ships. Now, that could be long-range bombers, for example, or it could be some of the really cool uncrewed systems, whether aerial systems or undersea systems that we're seeing proliferate around the world in places like Ukraine, but which Australian companies are really good at designing. So, whatever it is we do to sort of hedge the risk around AUKUS, we need to be doing that alongside it. Now, one of the things I say to people is, when we do our future casting, when we think about the future, any future we can think of, those autonomous uncrewed systems will play a large part of it. So, but there will be futures in which our traditional crewed systems, our manned systems of ships and planes and vehicles, we can think of futures where they're still relevant, but there's also futures where they become irrelevant. They're too expensive, and we can't afford to lose the people. Both of those futures have one thing in common, and that is there's a lot of autonomous systems in them. So to me, that's where we should be focusing our investment, in those autonomous uncrewed systems, particularly ones made by Australian companies, so we can design and build them here and are not dependent on other countries in wartime.
Oh, I got to say, Marcus, I spent a lot of time around defence media and defence journalism over the last sort of 15 years. But when I went to Land Forces last year, that was an eye-opener for me, the amount of remote autonomous systems of all kinds that were on display there. That is clearly the way things are going. And one of the important things here, I think, too, for Australia's military, as it is quite small, is that we need to be able to fight smart. And I think this is the opportunity here for people that are developing technology in this area, because there's obviously great spillovers, those sort of technology over time will find its way into civilian use for other uses. But in a military sense, this is absolutely the way it's going. And I think that's a real opportunity here for the Australian Defence Force.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it's interesting that everyone sort of wants the same stuff. Whether you're in mining or in agriculture or in border protection, you name it, they all sort of want the same stuff as defense. There's not a lot of unique things about defense stuff other than some of their systems go bang, which generally agricultural stuff doesn't and mining stuff doesn't. But everybody wants autonomy, in the sense of systems that can operate themselves and don't need a lot of people to drive them or command them. Everybody wants stuff that can operate in difficult environments. So whether that's in mines up in the Pilbara or in market gardens that are knee-deep in mud, or, you name it, and they want sensors, so things that can find targets and identify them. So if you're a farmer, you want to be able to detect feral cats and feral foxes and feral pigs. So it's all the same stuff. And Australian industry is actually really good at that. The problem is all of those things that you said you saw at the Defence Trade Show, unfortunately, the Australian Defence Department is not buying them from Australian companies at the moment. And we need to turn that around.
You think that would be almost, I mean, I don't like this term, but it is. It's almost a no-brainer, isn't it? There are a lot of small to medium enterprises in this country that are developing amazing technology, and I'm sure we could find adaptations for that.
Yeah, and they're selling it to Ukraine, and they're selling it to the mining industry, and they're selling it to agriculture, so they're great at it, So, I can't say this often enough. Defence should start to tap into that amazing Australian capability.
And it's tragic. You've mentioned the Ukraine situation a couple of times. As tragic as that is, in a macabre sort of way, it's actually been a testing ground, hasn't it, for a lot of this sort of technology. That's the really sad reality of it. But that's one aspect where the Ukrainians, again, they're a smaller military force. They've had to learn to fight smart, and they're using exactly this sort of technology to do exactly that.
And that's exactly right. It is tragic that, this is being a proving ground for the technology. And there's a lot of lessons to take out of Ukraine. Unfortunately, our Defence Force doesn't seem to be taking them. But, for me, a key lesson is if you go and buy something off the shelf from another country, it's not necessarily going to work really well for you. And one of the things we saw is that the US was providing some of its most cutting-edge missiles and drones to Ukraine, and they just weren't working, right? And the Ukrainians had to either modify them or develop their own systems that would work in the Ukrainian environment against the Russian opposition. And the lesson out of that is you need your own defense industry because your requirements are always going to be very different. And unfortunately, our military is becoming increasingly reliant on the US for technology. And we're never going to be completely self-reliant. We're not going to design and build fighter planes here, for example. But there is a lot more that we can do to be self-reliant, because if we have the industrial capability here, we can design and build systems rapidly that meet the ADF's need, particularly when conflict starts. You need that homegrown capability to be able to react and do things quickly.
I'd tell you, it's interesting. I'm a voracious reader in the techno thriller space, Marcus, and I actually at the moment I've gone back and I'm reading a classic in Red Storm Rising, the great Tom Clancy novel, and it just reminds me of what a fantastic technical writer that man was. One of the calls there was the Russians are coming. There's been talk about the Russians coming to our part of the world, and I thought we might just touch on that. Is there anything really to that talk about the Russians forward basing some aircraft in Indonesia? And if they were going to do that, why would they be doing that?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question. It's one of those sort of things that hit the headlines for a few days and then disappeared. Look, I'm not the world's biggest Indonesia expert. I'll say that up front. But, one of the things about Indonesia is that it fiercely defends its independence and it fiercely defends its sovereignty, and it has refused to enter into alliances with other countries. Even with sort of China putting huge pressure on it in the South China Sea and claiming waters that are part of Indonesia's EEZ. The Indonesians haven't run to the US and said, help save us from the Chinese. So I'd be a little skeptical that the Indonesians would allow the Russians to have a big Air Force base in Indonesia that the Russians would operate bombers out of. Now, the Indonesians are quite happy to, train and do exercises with other countries, including Australia. So they might do some exercises with the Russians. But I do think that a permanent Russian Air Force base is a bridge too far. Particularly, when we announced AUKUS, for example, the Indonesians were quite upset. Certainly, some Indonesians were quite upset. And they're like, "Oh, we don't want nuclear submarines in our backyard." But we explained it to them, and I think, generally speaking, Indonesian policymakers understand that. If they were to introduce a Russian bomber base in into Indonesia, they'd sort of be doing a reverse AUKUS to us. They would know that we would find that extremely concerning and would probably set back relations quite significantly.
Well, it would put their aircraft within striking distance of strategic bases here with Americans in them.
Yeah, but it would also make Indonesia a target. And why, not just for us, but for the US as well in case of conflict. And so I'm not sure the Indonesians really want to make themselves a target just to make the Russians happy.
Well, the other thing for the Russians too is that it's a long way from home for them. That's a long logistics supply chain for them.
Well, yeah, exactly right. And to sort of go, what's in it for them other than it's a good headline to sort of, one of the things we need to remember is that, yes, while Russia has nuclear weapons and it does have things like bombers, the war in Ukraine has shown the limits of Russian power. They are not a great power anymore. So, the best they can really do is sort of sort of almost propaganda activities like this, sort of a bit desperately saying, look at us, we're still meaningful. But, I think it is more desperation than anything.
I think they might have bigger fish to fry at the moment anyway, notwithstanding anything else. I talk about reading, and I thought we might just have a bit of fun as we draw to the end of this great discussion. Bit of theoretical stuff. A book I read recently was called Outrider by Mark Wales. He's a former SAS man here in Australia. And even by his own admission, he said, well, are we a little bit closer to this than in reality than perhaps I thought in a fictional sense? But the strategy around that book was that China decided to take parts of Australia, and we're sort of going 10, 15 years in the future from now. I've always been of the view that China doesn't need to take Australia. All they need to do is cut us off. If they cut our oil supply off, for example, we wouldn't really, nothing much would be running here after not too long. However, the idea behind that book was they didn't take all of Australia. They just took the parts of it they needed. That would be an interesting strategy, wouldn't it? I suppose they wouldn't really need all of Australia if they came here.
No, I mean, again,
it is a bit of fun.
I think a lot of our defence planning has been based on a failure of imagination to sort of think about, worst cases. But even saying that, I do find it hard to believe that China would need to invade Australia and occupy all of Australia. Now, history is always good to look at history and look at precedents in history. Even though the Japanese bombed Darwin, when you do this sort of historical analysis, very few historians think Japan really wanted to invade Australia. Even just northern Australia. They wanted to seal Australia off. Why? Because they wanted to stop the US using Australia as a base and launch, its counteroffensive against the Japanese to liberate the territories that the Japanese had conquered. And so that was what, the whole Guadalcanal campaign that's, gone down in history was about, because from the Solomon Islands, the Japanese could essentially seal Australia off from the west coast of the US. So to me, that's a more likely kind of scenario than an invasion of Australia. But, ultimately we have to go, well, the Chinese are developing massive military capability, as we spoke about before, larger Navy than the United States, all kinds of advanced military capability. So all kinds of stealth aircraft are being generated at a great rate. They're increasing their nuclear capabilities. You can't simply sort of wish that away and say, well, I just can't imagine what they would do with it. Well, that's probably a problem with your imagination. It's, they have the capability, and we need to be aware of that. And we also need to be, aware of what are the things we cannot accept another country doing. And so what are we doing to prepare for that, to be able to stop them from doing that? So, there are many scenarios that I can think of involving Chinese coercion or aggression against Australia, short of a full-scale invasion, aiming to occupy, every Australian city. So, just because we don't think that's going to happen doesn't mean we can just sit back and go, it's okay, we're fine.
Yeah, one of our great generals who sadly passed away recently, Jim Molan, used to talk a lot about strategy and failure and the risk of failing to strategize properly. I always appreciated the way he spoke about that, and I sometimes wish a few more of our political leaders. I wouldn't say our military leaders. There's a lot of very, very smart people in our military. I just wish some of our political leaders would pay a bit more attention to people like that at times.
Well, and what we've seen is if you don't demonstrate your will and your capability to defend yourself, I mean, things like Ukraine can happen to you. I mean, this is the really disturbing thing about our current military, our current strategic situation, is that we're seeing autocrats are willing to settle issues through force, and they're actually willing to absorb significant cost to do that. Now, maybe Vladimir Putin didn't quite anticipate the cost he is paying, but the loss of Russian lives means nothing to Putin. So what does he do? So you ultimately need the ability to, defend yourself and say to any potential adversary, if you do this, we will inflict significant pain on you.
Well, I guess we can sort of round that out by talking about the importance of think tanks and lobby groups and that sort of stuff. You're involved with Strategic Analysis Australia. Tell us a bit about your role in that in the industry.
Okay, so Strategic Analysis Australia is we call it a think tank, so basically a small research and policy institute. There's a small number of people involved in that. We all have a long background in defence, in various roles in defence. And so we write a lot, we speak a lot in a whole range of forums, including this one, so thank you, to try and raise public awareness of these issues, because I think you'd agree that, broadly speaking, the average Australian doesn't have too much understanding of defence issues, so we're trying to raise that broader awareness. Now, we do advocate for things we support, in particular, sort of greater defence spending. But if any government's going to increase defence spending, they need to tell the Australian population why that's needed, and Australians need to understand that. So that's all. The part of what we're trying to do is raise Australians' understanding of defence issues, but also raise their understanding of the seriousness of our strategic circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. I think education and communication are key here, and I think it's something that Defence constantly needs to work on is having that narrative with the Australian taxpayer and the Australian population more broadly, and just about the importance of all of these issues that we've talked about today and many more besides. Marcus Hellyer, it's been a privilege to meet you. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and thank you to your listeners for tuning into this.
Get in touch. Join the conversation. Find us online at clearsignal.com.au.
Southern Skies Media.